This is a film about popular songs. Not today's rock music, but the very first music to win widespread international popularity. It was a style that came into fashion about 450 years ago, and this is one of its first hits. That piece, The Gentle White Swan by Arkadelt, was one of music's first bestsellers. From its publication in 1539, it went through more than 40 editions over the next 100 years, a century that was the age of the madrigal. Now, the word madrigal, to many people, means something more like this.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la.
Well, that is a madrigal, but it's by no means the whole story. It's merely one example of a form that offers a huge expressive range, from the high-minded and serious to the light, witty, and often erotic. And being an English madrigal is just one variation of a style that was the rage of all Europe.
But really, its proper place is later in our story, which we're beginning in the northern Italian town of Mantua. It was here, in a sense, that the madrigal was born, and where it, well, not so much as died, has changed into something else. This palace, the largest in all Europe, was the home of the Gonzaga family. They had been the most important family in Mantua since the 14th century, when one Luigi Gonzaga led a gallant band who freed the city from oppressors. The family continued to protect the city, first as captains, then as marquis, and finally, in 1530, as dukes of Mantua.
But the person who is so important to the beginnings of our story was a Gonzaga only by marriage. She was Isabella d'Este, daughter of the neighboring Duke of Ferrara and wife of Francesco, the 4th Marquis of Mantua. Is came here in 1490 at the age of 16, and for most of the next 50 years held sway here. For long periods she ran the political affairs of the city, for the years while her husband was held hostage in Venice, and then again as regent for her son until he came of age. But politics were not her main interest. Her consuming passion was for the arts. As a Renaissance ruler, she thought it part of her duty, but even so, Isabella's enthusiasm went well beyond what was expected of her. She immediately set about extending the Gonzaga collection of antiquities and was quite ruthless about getting the things she wanted. When she borrowed pieces to study, their owners found it very hard to get them back. Her advisors included Leonardo da Vinci, who drew this portrait of her. Though she preferred the artworks of the ancients, she did commission many new ones: poetry, paintings, sculpture, ceramics, and even jewelry.
Many of the finest works are stored here in her grotto and in its adjoining studiola. There are two in the palace. This was the second suite of its kind, which was built for her on the ground floor when she'd grown older and rather stouter. And it's not hard to imagine these walls covered with specially commissioned paintings. At one end of the room, there were two bronze statuettes of Cupid, one by Michelangelo and the other by the most famous of all the Greek sculptors, Praxiteles. Of the two, Isabella preferred the classical piece. But of all the arts, the one which she really enjoyed and was best at was music. The ceiling was decorated with her motto and her device, a clef with the 7 sorts of musical rests used at the time. Arched over the ceiling, they symbolized celestial music, and beneath she studied and practiced earthly music. She could play several instruments very well, she sang in a good contralto voice, and she composed. She cultivated the native Italian song forms, which had developed to a stage where they were ripe to become one of the parents of the madrigal. This is a frottilla, the sort of piece Isabella used to study and sing. The words of this one are those of a lover who has grown so passionate that he's begun to stutter.
In Isabella's private garden, Anthony Rulli told us more about the forerunners of the madrigal.
Most Italian music was simply not written down at all, but improvised. We know they made music a lot. We have accounts of how much they enjoyed their music making, but no surviving evidence really for it in written notation. So the improvised spirit is essential to Italian music. They had a wonderful word for this idea, sprezzatura, or noble negligence. It's the idea of the courtier just improvising in the moment and creating as the spirit moves him. And I think this is what remained right through the 16th century.
Yet it was at the very beginning of the 16th century that Ottaviano Petrucci began in Venice to print and publish his first collections of music.
Well, that's certainly true, but I don't think this paradox is impossible to live with. The Italian improvisatory spirit was there, and added to this, Petrucci's printed volumes were a kind of codification of all current music practice: sacred, secular, serious, witty, vocal, instrumental. And all these things available for the first time allowed new things to happen.
Well, up to now, we've only mentioned with Italian names, and we know from our repertoire that many of the composers of Italian madrigals actually came from far away.
Yes, they were called the Oltremontani, from the other side of the Alps. And they were employed for the serious music making, the sacred music making, for the formal services and so on. But the Italians themselves provided the music for delight and diversion. So the style of sacred music was especially developed by the men from the north. Polyphony was an inspired way of imitating the music of the angels. They believed that the angels, not having bodies, had no need to breathe, so that their music went on endlessly. Whereas men, having to breathe quite regularly, had to hide this feature in order to get closer to the angelic music, so that one voice would start, and then the other would take over. And when he had to breathe, the other voices hid that point.
Creating an impression of seamlessness.
Absolutely. Seamless polyphony.
same northern composers had adapted this sacred style to secular pieces, like this French chanson. It's a gossipy piece about a girl who has been married off to an old peasant. But she's not too upset because he sleeps all day and she's left free to go into the woods.
Tout au long de la journée, dormir la journée, dormir ne cesse. La la la, crazy on du bruit sauvage, du bruit sauvage. La la, crazy on du bruit sauvage.
So far, we've been talking about the musical elements that led to the birth of the madrigal in the 1520s. The fusion of the cool polyphonic style from north of the Alps with the more expressive, improvising nature of Italian song. But at the time, people would have said that madrigals were more about words. They thought of them as settings of fairly serious poems, often about some aspect of love, to be sung by several voices.
And they might have gone on to quote from either Castiglione or Bembo, because both these men were leading figures in the fashion which brought madrigals into being. Pietro Bembo was a most influential champion of the Italian language and literature. At this time, when the country was divided into so many different states, one of the few things which united them was a common language. Of all the regional variations, Bembo thought that the Italian of Florence was the best, and as literary models, recommended the works of Boccaccio and Petrarch. Baldassare Castiglione, with his book The Courtier, set the standards of behavior for his age. The etiquette the book described spread from Italy in English, French, and Spanish translation. It portrayed all the skills of body and mind that a well-bred person should cultivate. Now, as far as music was concerned, Castiglione thought skills should be perfected but never shown off. It became very non-new to sing with a lute accompaniment. That was the sort of thing professionals did. Much better form to sing one's line discreetly in a piece of polyphony.
So you can see just how well madrigals fitted the fashion. Texts by or in the style of Petrarch and approved by Bembo, with the sort of singing recommended by Castiglione. Ultimi mei sospiri by Verdolo fits the bill perfectly.
This first generation of madrigal composers, led by Verdelo and Arkadelt, was laying down a set of models for the next generation of composers to build on and develop. The process was greatly assisted by the newly developing business of publishing. What a difference that invention was making to society. In the hands of religious reformers, the printing press was a most potent means of spreading Protestant ideas. For composers, it meant that their works could now be spread rapidly, far and wide, well beyond the realm of their own particular patron. Since each of the city-states had its own court and nobility, there was a ready supply of well-off, fashion-conscious customers, eager to buy the volumes of music that came in their thousands off the printing presses. But if Italy was the mother of artistic and cultural rebirth, she was also looked on as a prize to be fought over by the power-hungry princes of Europe. France, recently grown to about its present size, was still trying to expand. Spain, not content with colonies in the New World, made rival claims on the Italian peninsula, as did the German-speaking princes. Then the Habsburgs' domains were united under one man when the Emperor Charles V inherited them all. Soon, matters were further complicated by the rise of the Protestant faith in the north, which in due course led to the Spanish Armada and eventually the unification of England and Scotland.
With such political turmoil going on throughout the century, it's really small wonder that anyone had time for the gentle pleasure of madrigal singing. And for the most part, these events go unnoticed in the music. But not only did they go on singing, the more enthusiastic even formed exclusive clubs devoted to the study of madrigals. One of the first was founded here in Verona. The Accademia Filarmonica was made up of 13 earnest amateurs who employed a leading composer to direct their studies. He was required to give individual tuition and make settings of any text a member chose. Similar academies sprang up throughout Italy, where members met to analyze the latest compositions and, of course, to sing them.
Once the basic forms had been established, the next generation of composers went on to explore the range of subjects and the subtleties of expression that they could achieve. And since fashion played such an important role, doing something new made good sense from a publisher's point of view as well. To show the kind of expressiveness that a great composer could realize when he put a poem, as it were, under his musical microscope, we're going to look at this next piece in some detail.
The text couldn't have a better pedigree. It's by Petrarch himself. It's a sonnet that comes from near the end of a long series that he wrote mourning the death of his beloved, Laura.
Valle che della mente miei s'è piena, fiume che spesso del mio pianger cresci, fere silvestre, vaghi augelli e pesci che l'una e l'altra verde riva affrena. Aria dei miei sospir calda e serena, dolce sentier che si amaro riesci, colle che mi piacesti, or mi rincresci, ov'ancor per usanza amor mi mena. Ben riconosco in voi l'usate forme, non lasso in me, che da sì lieta vita son fatto albergo d'infinita doglia. Quinci vede il mio bene, e per quest'orme torno a veder ond'al ciel nuda e gita, lasciando in terra la sua bella spoglia.
When Jacques de Vert made this beautiful poem into a madrigal, he broke it up into short sections, some as short as just a single word, and he fitted to these little sections a musical idea that was designed to heighten the emotion that the word or words expressed. In the first section, the key word is lamenti, lamenting. Here, de Vert uses a big falling interval. It's just like a sigh that starts in the upper voices and works its way down to the lowest. For the next section, there's just one word, fiume, the river, that's being filled by the poet's tears. To illustrate this idea, there's a descending scale passage in which each voice joins, one overlapping the other. As the piece progresses, de Vert uses an astonishing repertoire of rhythms, melodic shapes, striking harmonies, and varied vocal textures to express the key words of each line. Listen for words like sospiri, sighs, and dolce, sweet. Although compared to a symphony, most of the madrigals don't take long to perform, at their best, they have a variety and emotional intensity equal to pieces many times as long.
Che da lieta vita son
Although madrigals were used in the main as a private leisure time activity, the style, being à la mode, began to be used for certain sorts of public music. Life for the leading families had a very important public side. Many palaces had loges like this as places to conduct business or hold banquets in full view of the populace. And when they had something really important to celebrate, weddings and victories and the like, lavish displays and festivities were called for. That, of course, meant music especially written. The pieces composed for such occasions were a kind of party political broadcast of the day. Words unstinting in their praise of the patron, set to bright, stirring music. Here's a typical piece, once again with music by de Wert. It was written for a coronation, and the text, addressing the new duke, runs, "Let heaven rejoice and Mantua swell with pride, for you hold both her scepter and mantle."
The way madrigals started developing in the latter part of the century has been given a name, drawn, as is often the case in music history, from the world of the visual arts. The term is mannerism, and perhaps it's best explained by looking at a couple of paintings. Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck is typical. Notice how he has exaggerated all the proportions. See, too, how big he's made the child in her arms. The point of all this was that by doing the unexpected, using unusual framing of people, either in the arrangement of objects around them or by distorting perspective, the familiar is made fresh again, and an extra emotional dimension can be expressed. There is a sensual, even erotic quality about this painting. The highlighting of the Virgin's breast makes her as much a Venus figure as the Mother of Christ. Venus and Cupid are, of course, the two central figures in this painting by Bronzino. Called an allegory of love, time, and folly, it's a series of images meant to be read by the viewer. By the 16th century, this visual language had been refined to such a degree that even then, many of its subtleties were difficult to interpret. Still, there's little doubt that eroticism is at the heart of this painting. Now, the madrigal composers started to employ the musical equivalents of these techniques, and for the same reasons: to surprise and delight, to heighten expression and sensuality. To achieve these arresting effects often meant that the music became harder. The madrigal began to change from being something a group of friends sang for their own amusement into something to be performed for an audience.
Although not necessarily a big audience. At the time this was taking place, Ferrara had become an outstanding cultural center. If the Duke, Alfonso II, favored you with an invitation to attend a concert in his inner chamber, you would have heard the most renowned group of musicians in all Italy. At their center were 3 highly skilled sopranos, whose voices had earned them the status of noblewomen at court. It was a sort of discreet professionalism, because their chief role was to sing in the Duke's musica secreta, his very private and exclusive concerts. These ladies, all accomplished musicians, performed solos or ensembles, sometimes accompanying themselves as they sang and danced. And no doubt their movements drew on the rich and sensual language of gesture we find in the paintings.
Dolcezze Amarissime, set by Luzzaschi, who very often accompanied the 3 ladies of Ferrara. It shows how the texture of the madrigal was beginning to break up. There are still 5 parts, which had become more or less standard, but now with instruments supplying the lower 2, some voices are definitely more important than others. Although Alfonso II was destined to be the last Duke of Ferrara, he gathered around him a sparkling court. It could boast one of the greatest poets since Petrarch, Tarquinius Tasso. His epic romance, Jerusalem Liberated, was a source of text for many of the late madrigalists. Tasso had succeeded another great Ferrara poet, Ludovico Ariosto, whose masterpiece, Orlando Furioso, was to inspire composers for the next 200 years. And when a nobleman and composer from Naples married into the family, something of the southern style came to Ferrara.
Don Carlo Gesualdo's music, with its strange harmonic sequences and passionate chromaticism, must have reminded people of his tortured early life. Gossip of how he'd slain his first wife, her lover and child had spread to Ferrara long before he arrived. But even if he'd lived a more ordinary life, we'd still remember him for his music. Languisce al fin is his setting of a poem by Fontani Rivi that compares the pain of departing from a beloved with the bitter agony of death. It's a common enough theme for a madrigal, and The Gentle White Swan expresses similar sentiments. But what a difference there is between that piece and Gesualdo's experimental treatment.
da voi parto, che da voi parto, che da voi parto, per mia cruda sorte, per mia cruda sorte, la vita lascio, la vita lascio.
By the end of the 16th century, the madrigal in Italy was beginning to change into quite new forms. But before we follow it along that path, we should look briefly at how the fashion spread throughout Europe. Many of the first generation of composers had come from north of the Alps, and they simply took the style back. The French took up the fashion quite early on. The king, François I, was a great patron of the arts who took pains that his court was the cultural equal of any. The German princes, too, wanted to keep up with southern styles, encouraged no doubt by their elected emperor, who now ruled over Spain as well. Wherever they went, madrigals used words of local poets, and the music was adapted to suit local taste. Musicians enjoyed a social prestige that gave them entry into that class of people who were able to travel about freely. But probably the most traveled and certainly one of the most famous composers of the day was Orlando de Lassus. He was at various times in Naples, Antwerp, Paris and Munich. As the madrigal style spread through Europe, it took on national characteristics. But nowhere did it enjoy such an Indian summer as it did in England. For little more than a couple of decades, which began in the last years of Elizabeth I's reign, English composers produced a spate of madrigals equal to any. Castiglione's ideas about the importance of music to courtly behavior had long been accepted by 1588, when Nicholas Young published his collection of Italian madrigals with new texts in English. It was an instant success, and suddenly madrigals became all the rage. So starting off with Musica Transalpina as their model, the English composers set about producing a madrigal form that was unique.
No, 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 Nigella, let Woolies prove thee, I cannot love thee. La 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 la. Henceforth complaining, thy love's disdaining, sit thy hands wringing, whilst I go singing. La 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 la. Henceforth complaining, thy love's disdaining, sit thy hands wringing, whilst I go singing. La 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 la
What the English liked was the amateur music-making side of it. Music, not poetry. It's curious that in an age of such great English poets, not least of whom was Shakespeare, the English composers almost totally ignored their works. They preferred light, sophisticatedly witty verses, which offered scope for melodic invention, and often featured a bright fala refrain. But lest you think that all English madrigals were light and frivolous, here's part of a more serious-minded piece, which the consort of music are singing with Elizabethan pronunciation.
Madame was published in England in 1619. Thomas Bota's style represents the ultimate development in the English madrigal. But in Italy, it was a different story. We have to go back 30 years to 1589, when a young composer, no more than 22 years old, took up his employment here in Mantua with the Gonzaga family. His name was Claudio Monteverdi, and his music was to transform the course of music history. Some have even called him the father of modern music. Within his long creative output, he published 8 volumes of madrigals, which contain all styles of composition. The earliest are superb examples of the Renaissance ideal of equal polyphony. The later volumes search out virtuosity. The attention goes to the treble and bass parts, and the voices are required to use an extended vocal range.
Monteverdi left Mantua in 1612, and in a sense, the madrigal went with him. He would still continue to write and publish music in both the old and the new styles. After all, in the arts, as with everything else, things don't change overnight. This is an impassioned piece of writing for the solo soprano voice, accompanied not just by a lute, but by 3 choirs of instruments which act, in a way, like the different voices of a vast 4-part madrigal.
Well, the madrigal's come a long way. And what a far cry that is from the original idea. Music for a few friends to sing together to while away a pleasant hour or so. And we hope you'll join us to do just that over the next few weeks as we go on our Madrigal History Tour.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass. Fa la 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 la. Each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass. Fa la 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 la. The springtide all in gladness doth laugh at winter's sadness. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. The springtide all in gladness doth laugh at winter's sadness. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. And to the bagpipe sound, the nymphs tread off their crown. La 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 la. And to the bagpipe sound, the nymphs tread off their crown. Fine and wise it we musing, you sweet delight refusing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Fine and wise it we musing, you sweet delight refusing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Say dainty lips and speak, shall we play barley break?
Descubra el espectáculo de la imaginación en A Gran Velocidad, título del sorprendente capítulo en el efecto mariposa. Al finalizar, no se pierda la película El Salón de la Guerra, dirigida por el cineasta D.A. Pinbaker.